Faith is a currency in this broken realm. The faithful are spent freely. I still remember the day they came for me. Not the administratum recruiters with their scrolls and stamps, not the munitorum clerks with their quotas and manifests. The ones I remember were the others, the silent ones in the dark crimson uniforms who stood behind the officials. They never spoke, they never had to. Their very presence was enough to ensure compliance. I knew what they were, of course. Everyone did. Commissars. The Emperor's justice made flesh. I was just a factory worker then, 17 standard Terran years of age, toiling away in Hive Tetragon's Factorum district like 10,000 generations of my family before me. My days consisted of 12-hour shifts, maintaining the great stamping machines that pressed out components for lasgun power packs. I had never seen the sky, not once in my life. The notion of stars was theoretical, something I had only read about in worn propaganda pamphlets that circulated through our hab block. The universe beyond our hive was as abstract to me as the Emperor himself. When the tithe levy came, I was not afraid. No, I was eager. Eager to escape the crushing mundanity of my existence, eager to prove my worth, eager to serve. The sermons piped through the Factorum voxcasters had filled my head with visions of glory. I believed them all. The ecclesiarchy's words seeped into my bones during those endless work cycles. Duty, honor, sacrifice. These were not just words, they were promises of a life with meaning. How little I understood. They processed 500 of us that day, 500 young men and women from my hab block alone, a statistically insignificant portion of the tithe demanded from our hive. We stood in neat rows in a grand processing hall while servitors took biometric readings and priests moved among us, daubing holy oils on our foreheads and intoning blessings in a language none of us understood. I was filled with pride when they marked me, with reverence when they pressed the symbol of the aquila into my palm with a heated brand. The pain was clarifying, purifying. At least, that is what I had been taught to believe. My name became a designation, TRX V7 8293J. My life became imperial property. My body became a resource to be allocated according to strategic necessity, and I welcomed it. Emperor, forgive me. I welcomed it. What comes next in my memory is fragmented. We were loaded into massive carrier craft, thousands of us packed into cargo bays meant for munitions and vehicles. The journey lasted weeks, though it felt like months. No windows, no chronometers, just the bone-deep vibration of warp engines and the constant monotonous prayers being broadcast over the Vox system. Many died during transit. Disease spread quickly in such confined spaces. The corpses were removed efficiently by servitors and, I presume, jettisoned into the void. No rites were performed for them, no names recorded. They had failed their first test of service. When we emerged, blinking and disoriented, we were no longer in the Tetragon system. The sky above was a sickly yellow, choked with industrial pollution not unlike our hive world, but different somehow, alien. We had been brought to a forward operating base on a world whose name I would not learn for many months. Later, I would discover it was Calidar Secundus, a contested industrial world on the fringes of the Segmentum Tempestus. The training began immediately. Not with weapons, as I had expected, but with prayer, endless, mind-numbing prayer. We would kneel for hours in the mud, reciting the litanies of faith and devotion until our voices gave out. Those who faltered were beaten, those who collapsed were dragged away. We never saw them again. Physical conditioning followed. Brutal regimens designed to break the body and rebuild it according to imperial specifications. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs failed. We carried crushing loads until our spines threatened to snap. We endured simulated combat conditions, sleep deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures, toxic environments. Many more died during this phase. Their names, too, were forgotten. Only their numbers remained in the Munitorum logs, marked as resources expended in preparation. Only after our bodies had been deemed acceptable vessels did we receive our first weapons training. I was assigned to a standard pattern Cantrail M36 lasgun, an ancient, unremarkable weapon that had likely passed through thousands of hands before mine. Its serial number had been worn away through decades, perhaps centuries of use. The Munitorium tech priest who issued it to me called it a holy instrument of the Emperor's will. To me, it was a strange and terrifying thing. I had never held a weapon before. The commissar assigned to our training cohort was a tall, gaunt man named Severus Crane. His face was a landscape of scar tissue, his left eye replaced with a simple augmetic that glowed a dull red in the shadows. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You are not soldiers yet," he told us on that first day. "You are not even worthy of being called servants of the Emperor. You are raw material, crude ore that must be refined through suffering and obedience. Many of you will be found wanting. Many of you will die before you ever face the enemy. This is as it should be. The weak must be culled so that the Imperium remains strong." I believed him. We all did. What choice did we have? Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. We learned to field strip our weapons in total darkness, to recite the proper prayers while applying sacred unguents to mechanical components we barely understood, to stand perfectly still for hours while ecclesiarchy priests examined our faith through painful psychic probes, to kill without hesitation or remorse. This last lesson was the most difficult for many. In the third month of our training, we were each given a prisoner. Heretics, we were told. Enemies of the Imperium who had been condemned to death. Our task was simple: execute them in the name of the Emperor. Mine was an old man, perhaps 60 standard years. His crime was not specified. It did not need to be. The commissar's order was all the justification required. I remember the man's eyes as I raised my lasgun. They were not afraid. They were disappointed, as if he had expected better of humanity. I pulled the trigger. The beam struck him in the center of his chest, burning a hole through his sternum and cooking his heart inside his ribcage. He made no sound as he died, just crumpled to the ground like a marionette whose strings had been cut. I felt nothing. That was when I knew the training was working. By the 6th month, only about 30% of our original number remained. We had become a cohesive unit, drilled to respond to commands without thought or question. Our individual identities had been systematically erased, replaced with a collective purpose: to serve the God Emperor through absolute obedience and sacrifice. It was then that we received our first combat deployment. The enemy was a separatist faction that had taken control of a vital manufacturing complex. Heretics who dared to question imperial rule. Our orders were to retake the facility with minimal damage to the infrastructure. The human cost was irrelevant. We moved through the sprawling factory complex in standard Imperial Guard formation. Commissar Crane stalked behind our lines, bolt pistol drawn, watching for any sign of hesitation or cowardice. The first resistance we encountered was light. Poorly armed civilians who had been pressed into service by the separatist leaders. They fell quickly under our coordinated lass fire. I remember stepping over their bodies as we advanced. Ordinary men and women in worker coveralls, not so different from what I had worn in my previous life. Some clutched makeshift weapons. Others held nothing at all. I felt a momentary flicker of something. Not quite doubt, not quite remorse, just a vague recognition that these people had once been like me. The commissar must have sensed my thoughts. He appeared at my side, his augmetic eye glowing malevolently in the gloom of the factory floor. "These were not people, guardsmen," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They were obstacles to the Emperor's will. Nothing more." "Yes, Commissar," I replied automatically, the response drilled into me through months of conditioning. He studied me for a moment longer, then moved on to inspect the rest of the line. I knew I had come dangerously close to something unforgivable. I redoubled my focus on the mission parameters, pushing all other thoughts aside. The deeper we pressed into the complex, the fiercer the resistance became. These were not just disgruntled workers now, but trained fighters with military-grade weapons. Lasgun fire erupted from entrenched positions. Improvised explosives detonated among our ranks. Men I had trained with for months died screaming around me. But we advanced. Always we advanced. To do otherwise was to invite summary execution from our own commissar. Better to die facing the enemy than with a bolt round in the back of the skull. I don't know how long the battle lasted. Time loses all meaning in combat. I remember only fragments, the acrid smell of burnt flesh and ozone from discharged lasguns, the constant prayer chants streaming from my own lips without conscious thought, the weight of my flak armor suddenly seeming wholly inadequate against the storm of enemy fire. When it was over, we had secured the facility. The cost had been high. Of the 120 guardsmen who entered the complex, fewer than 40 remained standing at the end. The separatists had been completely eradicated. No prisoners were taken. None had been expected. As we stood amid the carnage, Commissar Crane addressed the survivors. His uniform was immaculate, somehow untouched by the blood and filth that covered the rest of us. "You have served the Emperor today," he said. "But do not think this makes you special. Millions of Imperial Guardsmen across the galaxy have done the same. Millions more will do so tomorrow. You are not heroes. You are not individuals. You are instruments of Imperial will, nothing more and nothing less." Those words should have deflated any sense of accomplishment we might have felt. Instead, they reinforced what our training had burned into us. We existed only to serve. Our lives had meaning only insofar as they furthered the Imperium's goals. Personal glory was irrelevant. Individual survival was incidental. That night, as I cleaned the blood and carbon scoring from my lasgun, I realized something that would sustain me through the horrors to come. The Imperium did not need me to believe in the righteousness of our cause. It did not need me to understand the strategic objectives behind our missions. It needed only my obedience, my willingness to kill and die on command, and that I could provide. In the days that followed, we were deployed to a dozen different combat zones across Calidar Secundus, each mission blurred into the next, suppressing worker uprisings in manufacturing districts, clearing mutant infestations from abandoned hab blocks, executing suspected heretics in public forums as a warning to others who might harbor seditious thoughts. Through it all, our numbers continued to dwindle. Some fell to enemy action, others succumbed to diseases rampant in the squalid conditions of our forward operating bases. A few were executed by Commissar Crane for infractions so minor I can scarcely recall them now. Questioning an order, showing hesitation in combat, failing to maintain proper equipment. New recruits arrived to replace the fallen, fresh-faced youths from distant worlds who looked at us veterans with a mixture of awe and fear. They did not yet understand what service to the Emperor truly meant. We did not enlighten them. They would learn, as we had, through blood and fire and loss. I survived where others did not through any special skill or divine favor, but through a combination of blind luck and the complete surrender of my former self. I became a perfect instrument of Imperial will. I killed without question. I endured without complaint. I recited the catechisms of faith with absolute conviction, whether I understood their meaning or not, and in return, the Imperium continued to use me. After 18 standard months on Calidar Secundus, our regiment was relocated. The separatist movement had been crushed, the world's productivity restored to acceptable levels. Our presence was required elsewhere. We were loaded onto massive transport ships once more, packed into cargo holds like the munitions we effectively were. Our next deployment was to a world called Drevaris, a once verdant agri-world now contested by the forces of chaos. This was a different kind of war entirely. No longer were we facing desperate civilians with improvised weapons. Here, the enemy was a terrible reflection of ourselves. Traitor guard regiments who had fallen to the corrupting influence of the ruinous powers, augmented by all manner of unholy abominations. The sky over Drevaris was wrong. That was my first thought upon disembarking from the transport. Where Kaladar's atmosphere had been choked with industrial pollution, Dravaris's was diseased. Clouds, the color of bruised flesh, swirled in unnatural patterns. Lightning arced between them, not blue-white, but a sickly purple that left after-images burned into my retinas. The air itself felt hostile. Each breath brought with it strange scents that defied description, floral yet putrid, sweet yet acrid. My lungs rebelled against it, but there was nowhere else to breathe. No respite from the tainted atmosphere. We established a forward base in the ruins of what had once been a small farming community. The buildings were largely intact, but disturbingly altered. Doorways that led nowhere, windows that showed impossible vistas, walls that felt warm and yielding to the touch, as though they were made of flesh rather than rockcrete and wood. Commissar Crane ordered us to decontaminate the area. What this meant, in practice, was burning everything to the ground. We moved through the village methodically, applying promethium accelerants to every structure before igniting them with las fire. The flames that resulted burned in colors no natural fire should produce, blues and greens and purples that danced and twisted in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. The smoke from these fires was thick and black, carrying with it the stench of burning meat, though we had found no bodies. I remember thinking, as I watched a particularly large dwelling collapse in on itself, that we were not just burning buildings. We were cauterizing a wound in reality itself. That night, as we established a perimeter around the smoldering ruins, I experienced something new and terrifying. Doubt. Not the fleeting moment of recognition I had felt on Kaladar when confronted with civilians who reminded me of my former self. This was deeper, more fundamental. What if we were not the heroes of this story? What if the Imperium, for all its claimed righteousness, was just another faction fighting for control of a galaxy that cared nothing for human concerns? What if the Emperor? I halted that thought before it could fully form. Such questions were dangerous, heretical, the path to corruption and damnation. I had seen the alternative on Dravaris, the twisted forms of chaos cultists, the madness in their eyes as they threw themselves at our guns, screaming praises to entities I dared not name, even in the privacy of my own thoughts. Better to be a willing slave to the Imperium than a deluded servant of those things. I redoubled my devotion. I recited the litanies of faith during my watch shifts until my throat was raw. I maintained my lasgun with obsessive precision, applying the sacred oils and murmuring the proper blessings over each component. I volunteered for the most dangerous patrol routes, seeking to prove my loyalty through action when my thoughts threatened to betray me. Commissar Crane noticed. Of course he did. Nothing escaped his vigilant gaze. "You are troubled, Guardsman Venn," he said during an inspection. It was the first time he had used my name rather than my designation. The fact that he knew it at all was unsettling. "No, Commissar," I lied. "I am focused on my duty." His augmetic eye whirred slightly as it adjusted its focus on my face. "There are two kinds of men in the Guard, Venn. Those who embrace the truth of their existence and those who struggle against it. The former find a kind of peace in absolute submission to the Emperor's will. The latter suffer needlessly before arriving at the same destination." I said nothing. What was there to say? "You are approaching a crossroads," he continued. "I have seen it before. The moment when a guardsman must decide whether to surrender completely to his purpose or cling to some vestige of individual identity. Choose wisely." He moved on before I could respond, leaving me with a cold knot of fear in my gut. I had not realized my inner conflict was so visible. If the Commissar had noticed, who else had? Were my fellow guardsmen watching me for signs of weakness or corruption? Would I wake one night to find a bolt pistol pressed to my temple? I resolved then to excise all doubt from my mind, to embrace, as Crane had put it, the truth of my existence. I was a tool of the Imperium, nothing more. My thoughts, my feelings, my very humanity were irrelevant to my function. All that mattered was obedience. For a time, this renewed dedication served me well. I performed my duties with mechanical precision. I participated in a dozen combat actions against Chaos forces, emerging each time with minor wounds but my resolve intact. I watched as comrades fell to enemy fire or worse, to the insidious corruption that permeated Dravaris. Some went mad, turning their weapons on their fellow guardsmen before being cut down. Others simply wandered off during patrol shifts, never to be seen again. A few exhibited physical changes, mutations that marked them as tainted by chaos. These were immediately executed, their corpses burned to ash, and their names struck from all records. Through it all, I maintained my focus on the immediate, the next patrol, the next firefight, the next prayer service. I did not allow myself to think beyond the current day, the current hour. The future was a luxury I could not afford. Then came the Battle of Halliford. Halliford had once been a major agricultural processing center, a vast complex of silos and distribution facilities that supplied food to dozens of worlds in the sector. Now it was a stronghold of the Chaos forces, a festering wound in the landscape from which corruption spread across Dravaris. Our orders were to retake it at any cost. The assault began at dawn, though on Dravaris, the distinction between night and day had become increasingly meaningless. The diseased clouds never parted to reveal the Sunday. The only change was a slight lightening of the perpetual gloom, a shift from pitch blackness to a murky twilight that did little to improve visibility. We advanced across open ground toward the complex, thousands of guardsmen moving in perfect formation. Artillery batteries positioned behind our lines laid down a preliminary bombardment, shells arcing overhead to explode among the corrupted structures of Halliford. The impact sent plumes of tainted soil and debris skyward, each explosion briefly illuminating the battlefield with harsh, unnatural light. The enemy response was immediate and devastating. Heavy weapons fire erupted from entrenched positions along the perimeter. Men fell around me, their bodies torn apart by high-caliber rounds or reduced to ash by energy weapons of unknown origin. The neat formations of our advance quickly deteriorated into a chaotic scramble for cover. I found myself sheltering behind the burned-out hull of a Chimera transport, its crew long dead, its metal skin pockmarked with impacts from weapons fire. Beside me, a young guardsman I recognized from recent reinforcements was trembling uncontrollably, his lasgun clutched to his chest like a child's comfort toy. "Emperor, protect us," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. "Emperor, shield us from harm." Before I could respond, a round from an enemy heavy bolter struck the Chimera just above our position. The impact sent shrapnel slicing through the air. I felt a sharp pain as a fragment cut across my cheek, but I was otherwise unharmed. The young guardsman was not so fortunate. A large piece of metal had embedded itself in his throat, severing his carotid artery. Blood pulsed from the wound in rhythmic spurts, quickly soaking the front of his flak armor. His eyes found mine, wide with shock and incomprehension. He tried to speak, but only produced a wet, gurgling sound. I watched as the light faded from his gaze, his body going limp as his life drained away into the corrupted soil of Dravaris. I felt nothing. No sorrow, no anger. Not even the clinical detachment that had sustained me through previous combat actions, just emptiness, a void where human emotion should have been. And in that moment, I understood what Commissar Crane had meant. I had reached the crossroads he spoke of, and I had made my choice without even realizing it. I had surrendered completely to my purpose, excising my humanity so thoroughly that not even the death of a comrade mere inches from my face could provoke an emotional response. A voxcaster crackled to life nearby, carrying the voice of our company commander. "All units, advance. The Emperor demands victory. Any man found retreating will be summarily executed." I rose from my position without hesitation, lasgun at the ready. Around me, other survivors did the same. We moved forward as one, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, our boots sinking into mud, composed partially of the blood and viscera of our comrades. The battle lasted 18 hours. By the end, my lasgun's power pack had been depleted and replaced 6 times. My flak armor was in tatters, torn by shrapnel and scored by near misses from enemy fire. My uniform was stiff with dried blood, little of it my own. My throat was raw from screaming battle cries and prayers that had long since lost any meaning beyond their rhythmic familiarity. Of the 3,000 guardsmen who began the assault, fewer than 500 remained standing when Halliford finally fell. The cost had been enormous, but the objective had been achieved. The corrupted heart of Draveris had been reclaimed for the Imperium. As we secured the complex, purging it room by room of any surviving enemy forces, I came across a scene that would haunt me in the rare moments when my conditioning faltered and dreams broke through the chemical suppressants we were regularly dosed with. In what appeared to have once been a central control room, a group of Chaos cultists had made their last stand. They lay dead now, their bodies arranged in a circular pattern around a central figure. This was no ordinary cultist. He wore the remnants of an Imperial Guard officer's uniform, though it had been modified with grotesque trophies and symbols that hurt my eyes to look upon directly. What struck me most, however, was his face. Though corrupted by chaos, with ritual scarification and unnatural growths distorting his features, I recognized him. Lieutenant Merrick, an officer from our own regiment who had been reported missing after a patrol ambush 3 weeks earlier. He had not been killed, as we had assumed. He had been turned. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, Commissar Crane appeared at my side. He surveyed the scene with his usual detachment, his augmetic eye whirring as it took in details I might have missed. "This is why we fight, Guardsman Venn," he said quietly. "This is what awaits humanity if we falter even for a moment." "He was one of ours," I replied, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "He was weak," Crane corrected me. "He allowed doubt to take root in his mind. Doubt leads to questions. Questions lead to heresy. Heresy leads to this." He gestured at the corrupted corpse of the former Imperial officer. I nodded, accepting his explanation because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. If a commissioned officer, thoroughly indoctrinated and presumably strong in his faith, could fall to chaos, what hope did an ordinary guardsman like me have? "Burn it all," Crane ordered. "Purify this place with fire." And so we did. We saturated the entire complex with promethium and set it ablaze. The flames rose high into the diseased sky of Draveris, a beacon of Imperial retribution visible for miles around. We stood and watched it burn, our faces illuminated by the conflagration, our shadows stretching long behind us. In that moment, standing amid the carnage of battle with the heat of the purifying flames washing over me, I felt something unexpected. Pride. Not in myself as an individual, but in what I represented. I was a tiny cog in the vast machinery of the Imperium, yes, but that machinery had prevailed here today. Through sacrifice and unquestioning obedience, we had pushed back the forces of chaos, however temporarily. The feeling did not last. As the flames died down and the reality of our losses became apparent, it was replaced by the familiar emotional numbness that had become my default state. We gathered our dead for proper disposal, salvaged what equipment we could, and prepared to move on to the next objective. The war for Draveris was far from over. In the weeks that followed, our diminished forces were consolidated with remnants of other regiments who had suffered similar losses. Our designation changed, our commanding officers were replaced, but the nature of our service remained constant. We fought, we died, we obeyed. The new regiment was designated the 107th Draveris Purification Force, a name that reflected our primary mission, cleansing the corrupted world sector by sector, inch by bloody inch. Our ranks were a mixture of veterans like myself and fresh recruits, shipped in from distant worlds to replace our staggering losses. I found myself elevated to the rank of corporal, not through any particular merit, but simply because I had survived long enough to accumulate some experience. My duties now included training new arrivals in the basics of survival on Dravaris, how to recognize signs of chaos corruption in the environment and in their fellow guardsmen, how to maintain their equipment in the corrosive atmosphere, how to die with dignity when their time came. Commissar Crane remained with us, one of the few constants in our ever-changing circumstances. If anything, he had grown more severe, more vigilant in his scrutiny of the regiment for any signs of weakness or corruption. Summary executions became more frequent. Minor infractions that might once have been punished with extra duties now warranted a bolt round to the back of the skull. No one questioned this escalation. We understood the necessity. Dravaris had a way of working itself into a man's mind, planting seeds of doubt and dissent that could blossom into full-blown heresy if left unchecked. The Commissar's harsh methods were a preventative measure, a cauterization of potential infection before it could spread. I watched him closely during this period, studying his methods, his demeanor, the subtle signs that preceded his actions. Not out of fear for my own safety, I had long since aligned myself completely with Imperial doctrine, but out of a professional interest. Crane represented the pinnacle of what a servant of the Emperor should be, utterly dedicated, completely uncompromising, immune to the emotional weaknesses that plagued ordinary men. Or so I thought. The change was subtle at first. A slight tremor in his gun hand during inspections, a momentary hesitation before issuing orders, a tendency to stare off into the distance during briefings, as though seeing something the rest of us could not. I might not have noticed if I hadn't been watching him so intently. The other guardsmen certainly didn't, their attention focused solely on avoiding his wrath. But I saw. And what I saw troubled me deeply. The Commissar was faltering. The realization struck me with unexpected force. If Crane, the embodiment of Imperial resolve, could be affected by the corrupting influence of Dravaris, then none of us were truly safe. The thought was like a physical blow, momentarily disrupting the careful emotional suppression I had cultivated. I should have reported my observations immediately. That was the protocol for suspected corruption at any level of command. But something held me back. Loyalty, perhaps. Or maybe just the pragmatic understanding that an accusation against a commissar, even one with evidence, was more likely to result in my execution than his investigation. So I watched, and I waited, and I prepared myself for the inevitable moment when Crane's deterioration would become impossible to ignore. That moment came during an operation to secure a water purification plant that had fallen into enemy hands. The facility was strategically vital, as it supplied the only potable water in the region. Without it, our forces would be dependent on shipped supplies, severely limiting our operational capacity. The assault began well enough. Our regiment, now battle-hardened and accustomed to the peculiar horrors of Dravaris, advanced methodically through the outer perimeter defenses. Resistance was lighter than expected, which should have been our first warning sign. Chaos forces rarely yielded ground without exacting a heavy toll. As we penetrated deeper into the facility, the architecture began to change. Corridors that should have been straight developed subtle curves. Doorways seemed to shift position when viewed from different angles. The very air became thick and difficult to breathe, carrying a sweet, cloying scent that made my head swim. Commissar Crane led from the front as always, but his movements had lost their usual precision. He stumbled occasionally, catching himself against walls or support columns. His orders, typically clear and concise, became rambling and sometimes contradictory. We reached the central purification chamber without encountering significant enemy forces. The vast room was dominated by massive filtration tanks and treatment systems, all seemingly intact but inactive. The chamber was eerily silent, the only sound the dripping of water from overhead pipes and the shuffling of our own boots on the metallic floor grating. Crane ordered us to secure the perimeter while he personally inspected the main control console. This was unusual. Such technical assessments were typically the domain of the regiment's tech priests, but no one questioned the order. I positioned my squad near the main entrance, establishing a defensive firing line with clear sight lines to all potential approach vectors. From this position, I could observe the Commissar as he interacted with the control systems. His behavior became increasingly erratic. He muttered to himself, hands moving over the controls in patterns that seemed random rather than purposeful. At one point, he removed his gloves and placed his bare palms directly on the console surface, an action strictly forbidden by Mechanicus protocols due to the risk of contaminating machine spirits. Then, without warning, he drew his bolt pistol and fired into the control panel. The explosion echoed deafeningly in the cavernous chamber, sending fragments of metal and plastic flying in all directions. The other guardsmen turned in shock, lasguns raised instinctively before recognizing the source of the gunfire. "Commissar?" The company commander ventured cautiously. "Is everything all right?" Crane turned slowly to face us. His expression was wrong. The perpetual stern mask had cracked, revealing something beneath that was neither human nor sane. His organic eye was wide and bloodshot, darting rapidly as though tracking the movements of invisible entities. His augmetic eye had shifted from its usual dull red to a pulsing crimson that cast a bloody glow across his features. "I can hear them," he said, his voice hoarse and strained. "In the pipes, in the walls, in the water itself. They've been here all along, watching us, waiting for us to drink, to absorb, to become vessels for their return." No one moved, no one spoke. To question a commissar was death. To accuse one of heretical ravings was worse than death. We stood frozen in a tableau of collective horror as the bedrock of our regimental discipline crumbled before our eyes. "The water," Crane continued, his voice rising in pitch. "It's not water at all, it's their essence, distilled and distributed. Every drop we've consumed has brought them closer to manifestation. We've been their incubators, their living wombs. Can't you feel them growing inside you? Can't you hear their whispers in your blood?" He leveled his bolt pistol at the nearest guardsman, a veteran sergeant named Darrow. "You're already corrupted, all of you. The signs are there for those with eyes to see. The subtle changes in gait, in speech patterns, in the very color of your aura. You're not human anymore. You're their puppets, their flesh proxies." I knew what would happen next. We all did. Crane would begin executing us, one by one, convinced he was purging corruption when in fact he had fallen victim to it himself, and protocol dictated that we should stand and accept our fate. A commissar's authority was absolute, even unto death. But something inside me rebelled against this ending. Not fear for my own life, I had long since accepted that death in service to the Emperor was inevitable and proper. Rather, it was the recognition that allowing Crane to slaughter loyal guardsmen would be a victory for the very forces we had sworn to oppose. I raised my lasgun and fired. The beam struck Crane in the shoulder of his weapon arm, causing him to stagger backward. His bolt pistol discharged, the round intended for Sergeant Darrow instead impacting a nearby filtration tank, rupturing it and sending a cascade of foul-smelling liquid across the chamber floor. For a moment, absolute silence fell over the assembled guardsmen. What I had done was unprecedented, unthinkable. I had fired upon a commissar of the Imperial Guard. The penalty for such an action was not simply death, but excruciating, prolonged death, often followed by desecration of the corpse as a warning to others. Crane straightened, his face a mask of rage and madness. "Traitor!" he screamed, raising his bolt pistol again despite the charred wound in his shoulder. "Heretic, you've revealed yourself at last." Before he could fire, another last beam struck him, this one from Sergeant Darrow's weapon, then another from a different guardsman, and another. Suddenly, as though a dam had broken, the entire company opened fire. Dozens of lasgun beams converged on the commissar's position, turning him into a pillar of searing light. When the fusillade finally ceased, there was little left of Severus Crane beyond a charred, smoking husk that collapsed to the metal grating with a hollow, final sound. No one spoke. The magnitude of what we had collectively done was too enormous to process immediately. We had executed a commissar, not on the orders of a superior officer, not as the result of a formal tribunal finding evidence of corruption, but spontaneously in response to his obvious madness. By any standard interpretation of imperial law, we were all heretics now, traitors deserving of the most extreme punishment. Company Commander Thale was the first to break the silence. A veteran of 20 years' service, his face heavily scarred from countless engagements, he stepped forward and addressed the assembled guardsmen. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. No one answered immediately. Then Sergeant Darrow cleared his throat. Commissar Crane was killed in action while leading an assault on enemy positions within the purification plant. He died heroically, as befits a servant of the Emperor. Thale nodded slowly. "And did anyone witness anything to contradict this account?" Silence again, complete and absolute. "Very well," Thale continued. "Prepare the Commissar's remains for proper disposal according to Departamento Munitorum regulations. Secure this facility and prepare for potential counterattack." "The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects," we echoed automatically, the familiar litany providing some small comfort in the face of the unprecedented situation. As the company dispersed to carry out their assignments, Thale approached me directly. His expression was unreadable, his eyes flat and hard as he studied my face. "Corporal Venn," he said quietly, "you fired the first shot." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes, sir." "Why?" I considered my response carefully. The truth that I had acted to prevent the slaughter of loyal guardsmen by a corrupted commissar would still mark me as a traitor regardless of my intentions. But I could not bring myself to lie, not about this. "The commissar was compromised, sir, corrupted by the same forces we've been fighting. He was about to execute Sergeant Darrow based on delusional perceptions." Thale's expression didn't change. "That's a serious accusation, Corporal. One that cannot be verified now that the subject is deceased." "No, sir, it cannot." He was silent for a long moment, weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, he spoke again. "The official record will show that Commissar Crane died heroically in combat with enemy forces. Any deviation from this account by any member of this company will be treated as sedition and punished accordingly. Is that clear, Corporal?" "Perfectly clear, sir." "Good. Because the alternative is to report that an entire company of Imperial Guardsmen mutinied and executed their commissar. Such an incident would necessitate the decimation, at minimum, of the entire regiment. More likely, we would all be consigned to penal battalions or executed outright. The war effort on Dravaris would be severely compromised as a result. Is that an outcome you wish to precipitate, Corporal Venn?" "No, sir." "Then we understand each other." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Corporal. You're being promoted to Sergeant, effective immediately. Sergeant Darrow will be elevated to Lieutenant. The company requires experienced non-commissioned officers to maintain combat effectiveness." I saluted, though the gesture felt hollow under the circumstances. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me, Venn. I'm not doing you any favors. If anything, I'm painting a target on your back. When a replacement commissar arrives, they'll be watching the command structure closely, particularly those who received battlefield promotions immediately following Crane's demise." With that sobering thought, he left me standing alone amid the wreckage of the control room, the air still acrid with the smell of discharged lasguns and burned flesh. In the days that followed, we secured the water purification plant and reactivated its systems under the guidance of the regiment's tech priests. The facility began producing potable water once more, though few of us felt comfortable consuming it after Crane's ravings about contamination. Most preferred to subsist on the purified water tablets issued as part of our standard rations, despite their chemical aftertaste. As predicted, a replacement commissar arrived within a week. Commissar Eliana Vask was unlike Crane in almost every respect. Where he had been tall and gaunt, she was of average height and solidly built. Where his manner had been cold and distant, hers was engagingly direct. Where he had ruled through fear, she appeared to prefer respect. This last difference was the most unsettling. We had grown accustomed to Crane's brand of leadership, harsh and uncompromising though it was. Vask's more collegial approach made us suspicious. Was it a tactic to lull us into complacency? To trick us into revealing seditious thoughts or sympathies? No one dared voice these concerns, of course, but I could see the wariness in my fellow guardsmen's eyes whenever she addressed them. For her part, Vask seemed genuinely committed to rebuilding the regiment's morale and combat effectiveness. She instituted regular prayer sessions rather than the random, punitive ones Crane had favored. She consulted with company commanders on tactical matters instead of simply issuing orders and executing those who failed to achieve objectives. She even established a medal system for acts of extraordinary valor, something Crane had dismissed as pandering to human vanity. Most significantly, she did not immediately launch an investigation into her predecessor's death. She accepted the official account without question, at least publicly. Whether she harbored private doubts, I cannot say, but she never indicated as much in my presence. My new role as sergeant brought additional responsibilities and pressures. I was now directly responsible for the lives and actions of 20 guardsmen, most of them fresh recruits with minimal combat experience. It fell to me to train them, to instill in them the discipline and fatalism necessary for survival on Dreveris, while simultaneously ensuring their absolute loyalty to the Imperium. The irony of my position was not lost on me. I, who had participated in the execution of a commissar, was now tasked with indoctrinating others in the virtues of unquestioning obedience. I, who had directly contravened one of the most fundamental tenets of Imperial Guard service, was now expected to enforce those same tenets among my subordinates. How could I, in good conscience, punish a guardsman for questioning orders when I myself had committed the ultimate act of defiance? How could I preach the sanctity of the command structure when I had violated it so completely? These questions haunted me as I drilled my squad in combat formations, as I led them on patrol through the corrupted landscapes of Dreveris, as I recited the litanies of faith with them during mandatory prayer sessions. I performed my duties with mechanical precision, but internally I was engaged in a constant struggle against doubt and hypocrisy. Commissar Vask noticed, as Crane would have. During an inspection of my squad's barracks, she held me back as the others filed out for evening meal. "Sergeant Venn," she said, her tone conversational rather than accusatory. "You seem troubled." I stiffened to attention. "No, Commissar. I am focused on my duties." She smiled slightly, a gesture so unexpected it momentarily disarmed me. That phrase, delivered in precisely that tone, is the universal response of a guardsman who is, in fact, deeply troubled but unwilling to admit it. I remained silent, unsure how to respond to this unexpected approach. "At ease, Sergeant," she said, sighing. "I'm not Crane. I don't expect my subordinates to be emotionless automatons. The human mind was not designed for such perfect suppression of thought and feeling. Attempting to maintain that facade inevitably leads to complications." Her choice of words sent a chill through me. Did she know about Crane's breakdown? About our collective response to it? I kept my expression neutral, revealing nothing. "The official report indicates that Commissar Crane died heroically in combat," Vask continued, watching my face closely. "A noble end for a servant of the Emperor. Yet I find it curious that not a single member of your company can provide specific details about this heroic death. No eyewitness accounts, no consistent description of the enemy forces involved. Just a vague consensus that he died doing his duty." I remained at rigid attention, saying nothing. "I'm not seeking a confession, Sergeant Venn, nor am I looking to assign blame. What's done is done. But I need to understand the dynamics of this regiment if I'm to lead it effectively. So let me ask you this instead: was Commissar Crane's leadership style effective in maintaining morale and combat readiness?" The question was a trap, elegantly baited. To criticize a commissar, even a dead one, could be construed as sedition. To lie directly to a commissar was equally dangerous. I chose my words with extreme care. Commissar Crane's methods were appropriate to the challenges we faced on Dreveries. The constant threat of chaos corruption requires vigilance and strict discipline. A diplomatic answer, Vask observed. Allow me to be more direct. Crane's execution rate was the highest in the subsector. Nearly 15% of all guard casualties under his supervision were the result of summary execution rather than enemy action. This is not merely inefficient, it is actively detrimental to our war effort. I said nothing, though internally I was reeling from this information. I had known Crane was severe, but the scale of his purges exceeded even my darkest estimates. My approach will be different, Vask continued. I believe that faith and loyalty are better fostered through example than through fear. I expect discipline, certainly, but I also expect initiative. Guardsmen who can think, who can adapt to changing battlefield conditions, are more valuable than those who blindly follow orders to their deaths. These sentiments were so contrary to everything I had been taught about service in the Guard that I struggled to process them. Was this some kind of test? A ploy to identify potential dissidents within the regiment? I understand your skepticism, Sergeant, Vask said, correctly interpreting my silence. You've survived this long by suppressing your own thoughts and feelings, by becoming the perfect, unquestioning instrument of imperial will. I'm not asking you to abandon that discipline. I'm asking you to direct it more productively. She paused, considering her next words carefully. The forces we face on Dreveries are adaptive, cunning. They exploit rigid thinking, turning our own inflexibility against us. To defeat them, we must be equally adaptive. This requires guardsmen who can recognize corruption without succumbing to paranoia, who can exercise judgment without falling into heresy. With respect, Commissar, I finally responded, such distinctions are not easily made in the field. No, they are not, she agreed. Which is why I need officers like you, Sergeant Venn. Officers who have seen the horrors of this war up close, who have faced difficult choices and survived to apply those lessons. She was offering me something I had not experienced since being conscripted into the Guard. Trust. The concept was so foreign, so dangerous, that my instinct was to reject it outright. Trust led to vulnerability. Vulnerability led to death, or worse. Yet some small part of me, some remnant of the person I had been before the tithe levy came for my hab block, responded to her words. The idea that I could be more than just a disposable weapon, that my experiences and judgment might have value beyond simple obedience, was intoxicating in its novelty. I will serve as required, Commissar, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I know you will, Sergeant. She turned to leave, then added, almost as an afterthought, the Emperor's service takes many forms. Not all of them involve dying uselessly. With that, she was gone, leaving me alone with thoughts more dangerous than any I had entertained since my conscription. In the weeks that followed, the 107th Dreveries Purification Force was deployed to a series of increasingly difficult operations across the corrupted world. Under Commissar Vask's leadership, our tactics evolved. Rather than the frontal assaults and war of attrition that had characterized Crane's approach, we engaged in more surgical strikes, targeting key enemy positions and high-value assets. Our casualty rates decreased significantly, not just from the reduction in summary executions, though that certainly contributed, but from better tactical planning and more efficient use of resources. Guardsmen were encouraged to report anomalies and concerns through proper channels rather than suppressing them out of fear of being perceived as weak or corrupted. The change was not universally welcomed. Some veterans, conditioned by years of service under Crane's regime, viewed Vask's methods as dangerously lenient. They predicted disaster, a collapse of discipline that would leave us vulnerable to chaos corruption. These predictions gained traction when a squad from C Company went missing during a routine patrol of a supposedly secured sector. When the squad was found 3 days later, the evidence seemed to confirm the skeptics' worst fears. The guardsmen had been ritually murdered, their bodies arranged in obscene parodies of imperial devotional poses. Symbols of chaos had been carved into their flesh, their eyes replaced with small, pulsating sacs of unidentifiable organic material. The incident sent shockwaves through the regiment. Whispers circulated that Vask's lax policies had allowed chaos cultists to infiltrate our perimeter defenses, that her emphasis on individual initiative had weakened our collective vigilance. Some even suggested, in the most hushed tones, that Crane would never have allowed such a breach, that his harsh methods had been justified after all. Commissar Vask responded with uncharacteristic severity. She instituted a full investigation, personally leading a team of experienced veterans to trace the squad's final movements and identify potential security vulnerabilities. She temporarily suspended her reforms, reverting to more traditional guard protocols until the threat could be assessed and contained. I was assigned to the investigation team, my familiarity with patrol routes and local terrain deemed valuable to the effort. For 5 days, we combed through the sector where the squad had disappeared, examining every abandoned building, every unusual geological formation, every anomalous energy reading. What we discovered was worse than anyone had anticipated. The cultists who had killed the squad were not external infiltrators. They were guardsmen from our own regiment, members of B Company who had been stationed in a forward listening post for the past month. Isolation, combined with constant exposure to the corrupting influence of Drevaries, had turned them. Their transformation had been subtle enough to escape detection during routine Vox check-ins, but profound enough to drive them to betray and murder their fellow soldiers. The evidence was irrefutable. Personal effects belonging to the slain patrol were found among the cultists' possessions. Vox recordings captured fragments of their planning discussions. Most damning of all, one of the cultists was taken alive, though severely wounded, and confessed under interrogation by the regiment's attached priest of the ecclesiarchy. Commissar Vask personally executed the surviving cultist after the interrogation was complete, her bolt pistol ending his corrupted existence with a single shot to the head. The bodies of the other traitors were burned, their ashes scattered to prevent any taint from spreading. The entire incident was documented in excruciating detail and transmitted to Sector Command, along with Vask's recommendations for preventing similar occurrences in the future. To my surprise, those recommendations did not include a return to Crane's methods of pervasive fear and summary execution. Instead, Vask proposed a more balanced approach: increased rotation of personnel at isolated posts, regular psychological evaluation by ecclesiarchy priests, more frequent in-person inspections by commanding officers, and a buddy system to ensure no guardsman was ever truly alone, even during routine duties. When questioned about this decision by skeptical company commanders, Vask's response was pragmatic rather than ideological. Fear did not prevent this incident, she pointed out. These men served under Commissar Crane for years before my arrival. If his methods were effective at preventing corruption, they would have remained loyal despite my supposedly lax policies. She paused, allowing this logic to sink in before continuing. Moreover, it was precisely because of our new reporting protocols that we were able to identify the missing patrol so quickly and launch an effective investigation. Under the previous regime, their disappearance might have been attributed to desertion and dismissed with punitive action against their squadmates, leaving the actual cultists free to continue their activities. The argument was compelling, especially when supported by data showing the overall improvement in combat effectiveness and reduction in casualties since Vask had assumed command. Even the most conservative elements within the regiment were forced to acknowledge that her approach, while different, was not demonstrably inferior to Crane's in preventing chaos corruption. For my part, I found myself increasingly aligned with Vask's philosophy, not out of any personal affinity for the Commissar herself, though I respected her intelligence and adaptability, but because her methods produced tangible results. We were fighting more effectively. We were losing fewer men to both enemy action and internal purges. We were, in a very real sense, winning more often than we were losing. This realization was disturbing in its implications. If Vask was right, If fear and unthinking obedience were not the most effective tools for combating chaos, then what did that say about the broader imperial approach to warfare? About the countless billions who had been sacrificed on the altar of blind faith and rigid doctrine? About my own willing participation in a system that might be fundamentally flawed? Such thoughts were dangerous, bordering on heretical. I suppressed them whenever they arose, focusing instead on the practical aspects of my duties. The daily routines of training, patrol, combat, and prayer left little time for philosophical reflection, which was perhaps by design. A busy mind has fewer opportunities to wander down forbidden paths. Yet the questions lingered, surfacing in the rare moments of quiet between operations or in the liminal space between wakefulness and sleep. Not as fully formed doubts, but as vague disquiet, a sense that some essential truth remained just beyond my grasp. 3 months after the cultist incident, our regiment received new deployment orders. The campaign on Dravaris had reached a critical phase. Imperial forces had secured enough territory to establish a permanent presence, but significant portions of the world remained under chaos control. Rather than continuing the costly war of reconquest, High Command had decided on a containment strategy. Certain regions would be written off as irredeemably corrupted, sealed behind massive fortifications and subjected to regular orbital bombardment to prevent the spread of taint. The 107th was assigned to garrison duty along the primary containment wall, a towering structure of adamantium and rockcrete that stretched for hundreds of kilometers across Dravaris's northern continent. Our mission was simple in concept but grueling in execution. Maintain constant vigilance against chaos incursions, ensure the integrity of the wall's physical and psychic defenses, and eliminate any unauthorized personnel attempting to cross in either direction. The wall itself was a marvel of imperial engineering, constructed in record time by regiments of the Adeptus Mechanicus, with slave labor drawn from penal colonies across the sector. Rising nearly 100 meters above the blasted landscape, its surface bristling with weapons, emplacements, and observation towers, it was as much a statement of imperial resolve as a practical defensive measure. Our company was assigned to Section 42, a 10-kilometer stretch that included one of the wall's few access points, a heavily fortified gate used primarily for deploying counter-incursion forces when sensors detected chaos activity beyond the perimeter. The gate had not been opened in the 3 weeks since the wall's completion, but we maintained constant readiness for the eventuality, running drills twice daily. Life on the wall settled into a monotonous routine, 8-hour shifts of observation duty, broken by prayer services, equipment maintenance, and combat drills. The constant wind at that elevation carried the distant sounds of warfare from beyond the perimeter, a perpetual reminder of the thin line separating us from the corrupted wasteland beyond. Most guardsmen found the duty psychologically taxing. The combination of monotony and low-grade dread wore down even veteran soldiers. Sleep disorders became common. Minor infractions increased as discipline frayed around the edges. Commissar Vask responded by instituting mandatory recreation periods and rotating personnel through different duty stations to prevent the kind of isolation that had contributed to the earlier cultist incident. For my part, I found a strange comfort in the predictability of wall duty. After years of active combat operations, with their constant threat of immediate death, the relative safety of the fortifications was almost disorienting. I could plan more than a day ahead for the first time since my conscription. I could develop relationships with the men and women under my command that extended beyond the instrumental connections of combat units. I became known among my squad as a fair but demanding leader. I enforced regulations without the arbitrary cruelty that characterized many guard sergeants, but I also maintained exacting standards for equipment maintenance and combat readiness. My squad's performance metrics were consistently among the highest in the company, a fact that both pleased and worried me. Excellence attracts attention, and attention in the Guard is rarely beneficial. My concerns proved justified when, 3 months into our wall deployment, I was summoned to Commissar Vask's command post. Such summons were uncommon and usually indicated either a serious infraction or a sensitive assignment. Given my record, I assumed the latter, but prepared myself for either possibility. Vask's command post was austere even by guard standards. A simple metal desk, 2 chairs, a Vox communication unit, and a wall-mounted display showing the status of various wall sections. The only personal touch was a small, leather-bound book on the desk, its cover unmarked, its pages well thumbed. The commissar herself stood looking out the room's single narrow window, hands clasped behind her back. She turned as I entered and saluted. "Sergeant Venn," she acknowledged, gesturing for me to sit. "Thank you for coming promptly." I remained standing. "Yes, Commissar, how may I serve?" She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You've performed admirably during our wall deployment. Your squad's efficiency ratings are exceptional, and your personal conduct has been beyond reproach." "Thank you, Commissar." "I'm not flattering you, Sergeant. I'm establishing context for what comes next." She sat behind her desk, indicating again that I should take the other chair. This time, I complied. "I've received orders from Sector Command," she continued once I was seated. "The 107th is being redeployed, not the entire regiment, but select companies, including yours. We're to join a major offensive against a chaos stronghold approximately 200 kilometers beyond the wall." The news was unexpected. The containment strategy had been presented as a long-term solution, a way to avoid precisely the kind of costly offensive operations that had characterized the early phases of the Dravaris campaign. "May I ask what prompted this change in strategy, Commissar?" Vask's mouth tightened slightly. "Intelligence reports indicate the enemy is massing for a major push against the wall. Sector Command believes a preemptive strike will disrupt their preparations and buy us time to reinforce our defenses." It was a reasonable explanation, tactically sound on its face, but something in Vask's tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "You have concerns about the operation," I observed, then immediately regretted my presumption. Such direct questioning of a superior officer's assessment, especially a commissar's, was dangerously close to insubordination. To my relief, Vask didn't take offense. "Perceptive, Sergeant." "Yes, I have concerns. The intelligence island, incomplete. The projected enemy strength seems disproportionate to our assigned force, and the timeline for deployment is unusually compressed." She leaned forward slightly. "But my concerns are irrelevant. The orders come directly from Lord General Thalax himself. We deploy in 36 hours. I nodded, accepting the inevitable. In the Imperial Guard, orders were not subject to debate, regardless of their wisdom or lack thereof. "I'll prepare my squad immediately, Commissar." "There's more, Sergeant. Due to the nature of this operation, I've been instructed to reorganize our command structure. You're being promoted to lieutenant, effective immediately. You'll be leading a combined platoon of 40 men drawn from your current squad, elements of C Company." The promotion was shocking. Advancement from non-commissioned to commissioned rank was rare in the Guard, particularly under battlefield conditions. Such jumps typically required political connections or extraordinary acts of heroism, neither of which applied in my case. My confusion must have shown on my face, because Vask continued without prompting. "This comes directly from Colonel Dravik. He specifically requested you for this role, citing your combat record and leadership qualities." Colonel Harmon Dravik was the regimental commander, a remote figure who rarely interacted with line officers, let alone NCOs. I had seen him perhaps twice since joining the 107th and never spoken to him directly. That he knew my name at all was surprising. That he would single me out for promotion was baffling. "I'm honored by the Colonel's confidence," I said cautiously. "But may I ask why me specifically? There are more experienced sergeants in the company." Vask hesitated, something I had rarely seen her do. "The mission parameters require adaptability, creative thinking within the bounds of Imperial doctrine. Your handling of several difficult situations has demonstrated those qualities." It was a diplomatic way of saying that my willingness to bend rules without breaking them had been noted. Whether this was a reward or a setup for a fall remained to be seen. "Report to the regimental quartermaster for your officer's kit," Vas continued. "Then assemble your new platoon at Deployment Bay 3 for briefing at 0600 tomorrow." "Dismissed, Lieutenant Venn." I saluted and turned to leave, my mind racing with the implications of this sudden advancement. As I reached the door, Vask spoke again. "Lieutenant, one more thing." Her tone had shifted, becoming less formal, almost concerned. "Be careful out there. This operation feels wrong. I can't put my finger on exactly why, but something doesn't add up. Keep your wits about you, and bring my guardsmen back alive if you can." The warning was unprecedented. Commissars did not express doubts about operations to subordinates. They did not suggest that survival might be prioritized over mission objectives. They did not show concern for individual guardsmen as anything other than expendable resources. "I understand, Commissar," I replied, though in truth I understood nothing about this situation. "I don't think you do, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "But you will." The words followed me as I left her office, an ominous forecast of what awaited beyond the wall. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of preparation. I received my officer's insignia and equipment, including a power sword I had no training to use effectively, and a bolt pistol that felt unwieldy compared to the lasgun I had carried for years. My new uniform was clean and unmarked, lacking the campaign ribbons and unit designations that would normally identify an officer's experience and affiliations. When I inquired about this irregularity, the quartermaster merely shrugged. "Special orders, sir. The whole deployment is being handled differently. Need to know basis only." Assembling my new platoon presented its own challenges. My original squad accepted my promotion with a mixture of pride and apprehension. They knew me, trusted my leadership, but were unsure what the change in status would mean for their day-to-day operations. The C Company elements assigned to my command were more openly skeptical. They had their own NCOs, their own established dynamics. Being reassigned to serve under an unknown lieutenant from another company was disruptive and potentially dangerous in a combat situation where unit cohesion could mean the difference between life and death. I addressed these concerns as best I could, emphasizing our common purpose and the importance of the coming mission, though I had few concrete details to share. I conducted abbreviated drills to familiarize myself with their capabilities and establish a functional command structure. The time was insufficient for proper integration, but it was all we had. The briefing at 0600 did little to alleviate my growing unease. Colonel Dravik himself conducted it, a lean, hard-faced man whose augmetic right arm whirred softly as he manipulated the hololithic display showing our target. "This is Desolation Point," he explained, indicating a jagged rock formation rising from the blasted plain beyond the wall. "According to our intelligence, it houses the command center for Chaos forces in this sector. Your mission is to penetrate the facility, eliminate the leadership, and retrieve any intelligence materials you find." The objective seemed clear enough, if ambitious. What troubled me were the logistics. Our force consisted of just 200 guardsmen, divided into 5 platoons. We would be deployed via Valkyrie transports, inserting 10 kilometers from the target and proceeding on foot to avoid early detection. Support would be minimal, no artillery, no armor, no air cover beyond the initial insertion. "Sir," one of the other newly promoted lieutenants ventured, "the intelligence estimates enemy strength at approximately 500 cultists, plus an unknown number of corrupted PDF forces. Is our assigned strength sufficient for the objective?" Colonel Dravik's expression hardened. "The element of surprise will compensate for our numerical disadvantage, Lieutenant. Additionally, this is primarily a stealth operation. We're not looking to engage the bulk of enemy forces, merely to decapitate their command structure." It was a reasonable response on the surface, but it didn't address the fundamental issue. Even if we achieved total surprise the moment we struck at the enemy leadership, we would face the full force of their defenses with no extraction plan beyond fighting our way back across 10 kilometers of hostile territory. No one raised further objections. The colonel's tone had made it clear that the operational parameters were not open to discussion. We received our specific assignments, platoon deployment zones, and communication protocols. Then we were dismissed to make final preparations. As we filed out of the briefing room, Colonel Dravik called me back. "Lieutenant Venn, a moment of your time." I remained at attention as the others left, wondering what additional orders or information the colonel might have for me specifically. Once we were alone, Dravik's demeanor changed subtly. The rigid formality remained, but there was a new intensity in his gaze as he studied me. "You were Commissar Crane's unit before his heroic death in action, were you not?" The question sent a chill through me. "Yes, sir. I served under Commissar Crane for approximately 2 years before his fall, before his death in combat." Dravik caught my slip but showed no reaction beyond a slight narrowing of his eyes. Crane was a fine officer, dedicated, uncompromising in his enforcement of imperial doctrine. His loss was significant. "Yes, sir." I kept my response neutral, non-committal. "Your subsequent service under Commissar Vask has been exemplary," Dravik continued. "She speaks highly of your adaptability and initiative, qualities that will be essential for the coming operation." "Thank you, sir. I'm honored by her assessment." Dravik moved closer, his voice dropping slightly though we were alone in the room. "This mission is of the utmost importance, Lieutenant. Its success or failure will have implications far beyond the tactical situation on Drevaris. I selected you personally because I believe you understand what it means to serve the Emperor, truly serve him, regardless of personal cost." There was something in his tone, a fervent quality that reminded me uncomfortably of Crane in his final days. Not madness, precisely, but a zealotry that transcended rational military calculation. "I will do my duty, sir," I replied carefully. "I know you will." Dravik placed his natural hand on my shoulder, an unusually personal gesture from a senior officer. "The Emperor protects, Lieutenant Venn, but only those who prove worthy of his protection." With that cryptic statement, he dismissed me. I left the briefing room with more questions than answers and a growing sense of foreboding about the mission ahead. Deployment came at 0200 the following morning. Under cover of darkness, our 5 platoons boarded a squadron of Valkyrie transports at the Wall's primary airfield. The loading was conducted in near-total silence, with even the aircraft's engines muted by specialized suppression systems. Every aspect of the operation emphasized stealth and secrecy. My platoon occupied the 3rd Valkyrie in the formation. The interior was cramped, with barely enough room for the 40 guardsmen plus their equipment. The men sat in 2 rows facing each other, eyes forward, expressions grim beneath their helmets. No one spoke. The only sounds were the muffled whine of the engines and the occasional metallic click as someone adjusted their weapon or armor. I studied their faces in the dim red lighting of the transport bay. Some I knew well from my original squad. Trooper Malk, with his perpetually furrowed brow. Corporal Hezrin, whose left eye was a basic augmetic replacement after a shrapnel wound. Young Guardsman Ento, who had joined us just before the Wall deployment, his face still carrying traces of the civilian he had been mere months ago. Others from C Company were less familiar. Veterans with hard eyes and impassive expressions. New recruits trying to mask their fear with rigid discipline. All of them looked to me now for leadership. All of them would live or die based partly on my decisions in the coming hours. The weight of that responsibility settled over me like a physical burden, compressing my chest and making each breath an effort. The flight lasted approximately 40 minutes. We maintained low altitude, following terrain contours to avoid detection by enemy sensors. The ride was turbulent, the pilot pushing the aircraft to its limits to minimize our exposure. Several guardsmen became visibly ill, though training and discipline prevented them from breaking composure. When we landed, it was not the controlled descent I had expected, but a combat drop. The Valkyrie hovered 2 meters above the ground for mere seconds, barely long enough for us to jump clear before it ascended again and banked away. The maneuver was executed with minimal illumination and near-silent engines, leaving us in darkness as the aircraft disappeared into the night sky. We assembled quickly, each squad falling into predetermined formations, weapon systems active and scanning for threats. The landscape around us was a desolation of blasted rock and drifting ash, illuminated only by the sickly light of Dravaris's largest moon filtering through the diseased clouds overhead. I activated my microbead Vox link, confirming positions with my squad leaders while maintaining communication silence with the other platoons as per operational protocols. Once I was satisfied with our deployment, I gave the signal to advance. We moved through the wasteland in standard guard formation, 5 meters between each soldier, squads arranged in a staggered pattern to maximize field of fire coverage while minimizing vulnerability to area effect weapons. Our progress was slow, deliberate, each step carefully placed to avoid loose rocks or debris that might betray our presence. The terrain grew increasingly hostile as we approached our target. The ground beneath our boots transitioned from compacted ash to something more unsettling. It yielded slightly with each step, not like mud or sand, but like flesh. In places, it seemed to pulse with a rhythm independent of our movements, as though the land itself were breathing. I noticed several guardsmen making the sign of the Aquila as they walked, their lips moving in silent prayer. 2 kilometers from Desolation Point, we encountered our first evidence of enemy presence, not sentries or defensive positions, but a ritual site, a circular arrangement of stone monoliths, each carved with symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. Between them, arranged in concentric rings, were human remains in various states of decomposition. Some were recognizably Imperial Guard, the tattered remnants of uniforms still clinging to desiccated flesh. Others wore the distinct armor of PDF forces. A few appeared to be civilians, though it was difficult to be certain given the condition of the bodies. Most disturbing of all was the fact that some of the corpses showed signs of movement, subtle twitches of exposed muscle tissue, fingers curling and uncurling without purpose, unseeing eyes that nonetheless tracked our passage through the ritual space. I ordered the platoon to maintain formation and proceed without stopping. There was nothing we could do for these poor souls except complete our mission and ensure their desecration was avenged. Still, I noted the exact coordinates of the site in my field logbook for later purification by Ecclesiarchy flame units. As we drew closer to Desolation Point itself, the corruption of the landscape intensified. The rock formations began to resemble organic structures, rib cages, spinal columns, vast jaws frozen in silent screams. Pools of liquid that might have been water had it not been the color and consistency of blood gathered in natural depressions, their surfaces rippling occasionally as something moved beneath. The air grew thick with an odor I can only describe as wrong. Not merely foul or putrid, though it was certainly both, but fundamentally incorrect, as though it violated some basic law of nature by its very existence. Our rebreather units filtered the worst of it, but nothing could completely eliminate the sensation that we were inhaling corruption with every breath. Despite these horrors, we encountered no active resistance, no sentries challenged our advance, no patrols crossed our path. This absence of opposition, when we had expected significant security around such an important enemy installation, was more unsettling than direct confrontation would have been. I voxed the other platoon leaders, confirming they were experiencing similar conditions in their approach vectors. All reported the same eerie lack of enemy contact. Colonel Dravik, monitoring from the command Valkyrie circling high above our position, ordered us to proceed as planned, but with elevated caution. Desolation Point itself loomed before us, a jagged spire of rock that resembled a gnarled hand reaching toward the sky. At its base, carved into the living stone, was what appeared to be the entrance to a subterranean complex. No guards stood watch, no weapon emplacements protected the approach. The entrance gaped open like a wound, spilling sickly green illumination onto the blasted ground before it. We took position according to the operational plan, my platoon covering the eastern approach, while the others established a perimeter around the remaining sectors. The assault team, comprised of selected veterans from each platoon under the direct command of Colonel Dravik himself, prepared to enter the facility. That was when Colonel Dravik's Valkyrie descended, landing directly before the entrance in a swirl of ash and pulverized rock. The colonel emerged, accompanied by a figure I had not expected to see, Commissar Vask. Behind them came a squad of soldiers I did not recognize from our regiment, wearing specialized environmental armor with no unit insignia. Dravik approached my position, his augmetic arm gleaming dully in the green light emanating from the entrance. "Lieutenant Venn," he acknowledged. "Your platoon will accompany the primary assault team into the facility. The other units will maintain perimeter security and serve as our extraction coverage." This was a deviation from the original plan, which had called for all platoons to remain outside while the specialized assault team cleared the facility. Before I could formulate a proper query about this change, Commissar Vask moved to my side. "The situation has evolved, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "Intelligence indicates the facility is more extensive than initially believed. Additional manpower is required for a thorough sweep." There was something in her tone, a subtle emphasis on certain words, that suggested she was communicating more than the literal meaning of her statement. Her eyes held mine for a fraction longer than necessary, conveying a warning I could not fully decipher. "Understood, Commissar," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "We stand ready to serve." I signaled my squad leaders, and we reformed into assault configuration. 40 guardsmen arranged in 4 10-man squads, with my command unit at the center. We advanced toward the entrance, lasguns at the ready, senses straining for any sign of ambush or trap. Colonel Dravik's special squad led the way, their movements displaying a level of training and coordination that exceeded standard guard protocols. They entered the facility first, specialized Auspex units scanning for threats, weapons covering all approach vectors. My platoon followed, maintaining tactical spacing despite the increasingly narrow confines of the passageway. The interior of Desolation Point defied conventional description. What had appeared from outside to be a natural rock formation revealed itself as something far more disturbing. The walls pulsed with an inner light that cast no shadows. The floor beneath our boots felt warm and yielding, as though we walked on the surface of a living organism. The air was thick with the smell of copper and ozone, making each breath a struggle despite our rebreather units. The passageway descended at a steep angle, corkscrewing deeper into the earth with each turning. Alcoves lined the walls at irregular intervals, each containing objects that my mind refused to fully process. Organic mechanical hybrids that might have been weapons or might have been torture devices, containers of flowing liquid that responded to our proximity by changing color or viscosity. What appeared to be human remains, arranged in configurations that suggested they still served some terrible purpose despite death. We proceeded in silence, broken only by the soft clicks of our equipment and the occasional whispered update over the Voxnet. 20 minutes into our descent, the passageway opened into a vast chamber that stretched beyond the range of our lumens. The ceiling arched high overhead, supported by columns that resembled massive spinal cords complete with nerve bundles and ganglia. The floor was a mosaic of what appeared to be human skin of various hues, stitched together in patterns that formed blasphemous symbols when viewed from above. At the center of the chamber stood a structure that dominated the space, a pyramidal altar composed of fused weapons and armor, much of it recognizably imperial in origin. Atop this grisly monument burned a flame that emitted no light, yet somehow defined the darkness around it, as though it were a hole in reality rather than a source of illumination. Before the altar knelt 7 figures in the tattered remains of what had once been Imperial Guard officer uniforms. They were arranged in a semicircle, their heads bowed in supplication or prayer, their hands clasped before them. From my position, I could not see their faces, but their postures suggested total submission to whatever entity or power the altar represented. Colonel Dravik raised his hand, signaling a halt. His special squad deployed in a protective formation around him as he studied the scene before us. After a moment, he turned to address the combined force. "This is what we came for," he said, his voice tight with an emotion I could not identify. "The heart of the enemy's command structure. We will eliminate these traitors, destroy their unholy altar. The Emperor's justice will be done this day." He signaled his special squad forward. They advanced with precision, weapons trained on the kneeling figures, ready to execute them without warning or ceremony. Standard procedure when dealing with confirmed chaos cultists, especially those who had once sworn oaths to the Emperor. What happened next occurred so quickly that my conscious mind barely registered the sequence of events. One moment, the special squad was advancing toward the kneeling figures. The next, Commissar Vask's bolt pistol was discharging, the round taking one of Dravik's men in the back of the head, exploding it in a spray of bone and brain matter. "It's a trap!" she shouted, her voice carrying a note of desperation I had never heard from her before. "Dravik has betrayed the Imperium. The kneeling figures are loyal guardsmen being offered as sacrifices." Chaos erupted. The special squad turned as one, their weapons now aimed not at the kneeling figures but at us. Colonel Dravik's augmetic arm transformed, fingers elongating into blade-like appendages as he lunged at Commissar Vask. I reacted on instinct, decades of combat training overriding the shock of betrayal. "Platoon, defensive positions, target the Colonel's squad," I bellowed into my Vox link, simultaneously bringing my own bolt pistol to bear. My guardsmen responded with admirable discipline, dropping into cover positions and returning fire against Dravik's men. Lus beams crisscrossed the chamber, illuminating the darkness in staccato flashes of red energy. Bolt rounds replied, the explosive projectiles detonating against rock formations and flesh with equal destructive effect. I focused on Colonel Dravik himself, who was engaged in close combat with Commissar Vask. His transformed arm slashed at her with inhuman speed, each strike narrowly avoided as she backpedaled, firing her bolt pistol repeatedly at his center mass. The rounds impacted but seemed to cause minimal damage, suggesting armor or unnatural resilience. Understanding bloomed in my mind, terrible in its clarity. Dravik had been corrupted. Perhaps he always had been. His rise through the ranks a carefully orchestrated infiltration of the Imperial command structure. Or perhaps he had fallen during the Dreveries campaign, the world's corrupting influence finding purchase in his soul despite his apparent strength. The specifics didn't matter. What mattered was that he had led us here not to strike at the heart of Chaos Command, but to deliver us as sacrifices to whatever dark power he now served. I raised my bolt pistol, taking careful aim at Dravik's head as he continued his assault on Vask. The weapon felt unfamiliar in my hand, heavier and less precise than the lasgun I had carried for so many years. Still, at this range, with a stationary target, I couldn't miss. I pulled the trigger. The bolt pistol bucked in my grip, the recoil stronger than I had anticipated. The round flew true, striking Dravik in the temple, and bounced off, leaving nothing but a superficial wound that leaked a fluid too dark and thick to be human blood. He turned toward me, his face contorting in a smile that stretched too wide for human anatomy to permit. "Lieutenant Venn," he said, his voice overlaid with a second, deeper tone that seemed to emanate not from his throat, but from the very air around him. "The promising officer, the perfect servant. How disappointing to find you lacking in the final test." With a gesture of his transformed arm, he sent Commissar Vask flying across the chamber to crash against one of the organic columns. She slumped to the ground, momentarily stunned but still alive based on her movements. Dravik advanced toward me, each step leaving a smoldering imprint in the floor of fused human skin. "You could have been part of something glorious," he continued, a new order rising from the ashes of the Emperor's failed Imperium. "But like all good little guardsmen, you cling to your indoctrination even when presented with the truth." Around us, the battle continued. My platoon was holding its own against Dravik's special squad, their numbers advantage compensating for the enemy's superior equipment and training. But casualties were mounting on both sides. the chamber's floor now slick with blood and worse substances as lace beams and bolt rounds found their marks. I stood my ground as Dravik approached, knowing that retreat was not an option. Not just because of ingrained guard discipline or fear of punishment for cowardice, but because there was nowhere to retreat to. We were deep underground in enemy territory, surrounded by corruption, with no extraction plan beyond fighting our way back to the surface. What truth? I asked, playing for time as I assessed my limited options. My bolt pistol had proven ineffective. The power sword at my hip was a weapon I had no real training with. My squad was engaged with the enemy and couldn't provide supporting fire without risking hitting me. Dravik's unnatural smile widened further. The truth that your precious emperor is nothing but a corpse sustained by technology and sacrifice. The truth that the Imperium is dying, has been dying for millennia, rotting from within, even as it continues its pointless struggle against the inevitable. The truth that there are powers in this universe that offer more than endless sacrifice for a lost cause. As he spoke, his form began to change more dramatically. His uniform split along the seams as his body expanded, growing taller and broader. His skin darkened to a deep crimson, the texture transforming from human flesh to something resembling armored plates. His face elongated, features shifting into a bestial mask that retained just enough of his original appearance to be recognizable. This was Dravik's true form, or at least the form his corruption had granted him. A daemon or daemon-possessed, I couldn't be sure which. Either way, he was beyond my ability to combat effectively with the weapons at my disposal, yet I had to try. Not just for my own survival, but for my platoon, for Commissar Vask, for the kneeling figures who I now recognized as captured loyal officers being prepared for some dark ritual. Most of all, for the oath I had sworn when the tithe levy came for my hab block all those years ago. An oath I had kept through hell and horror, through doubt and disillusionment, through the grinding attrition of endless war. I drew the power sword, its activation rune glowing blue as the disruptor field hummed to life around the blade. The weapon felt unbalanced in my grip, designed for someone with formal training in swordsmanship rather than a former factory worker who had learned combat through the brutal pragmatism of the guard. For the Emperor, I said, the words a statement of fact rather than a battle cry. Whatever my private doubts, whatever questions lurked in the corners of my mind during quiet moments, I knew where I stood in this moment. Against the darkness, against corruption, against the betrayal of everything humanity had built across 10,000 years of struggle. Dravik laughed, the sound echoing with unnatural harmonics that set my teeth on edge. The Emperor cannot hear you, Lieutenant. Not here, not anywhere. He sits blind and deaf on his golden throne, sustained by the very sacrifice he claimed to abhor. Your faith is wasted on a false god. He lunged forward with inhuman speed, his transformed arm slashing toward my throat in a killing blow. I barely managed to interpose the power sword, the disruptor field flaring brilliantly as it met whatever unnatural substance now composed Dravik's flesh. The impact sent shock waves up my arm, nearly causing me to lose my grip on the sword. But decades of guard conditioning held, my muscles responding automatically to maintain control of the weapon, even as pain lanced through my shoulder joint. Dravik pressed his advantage, raining blows upon me from multiple angles, his transformed body possessing a speed and strength no human could match. I defended as best I could, the power sword my only protection against attacks that would have torn through flak armor as though it were parchment. Each successful parry sent jolts of agony through my increasingly numb arm. Each near miss left shallow cuts on my face, neck, and torso where Dravik's talons had penetrated my armor just enough to draw blood. I was fighting a losing battle, and we both knew it. Your resistance is admirable, but futile, Dravik said, his voice now fully transformed into the deep, resonant tones of whatever entity possessed him. Like the Imperium itself, you fight with determination but without hope. How many billions have died for your corpse god? How many worlds have burned in his name? And to what end? He punctuated this last question with a particularly vicious strike that sent me staggering backward, the power sword nearly torn from my grasp. I regained my footing just in time to parry another attack, this one coming within millimeters of disemboweling me. "The same could be asked of chaos," I retorted, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice despite my desperate situation. "How many souls corrupted? How many civilizations destroyed? And to what end? Power for a few at the cost of damnation for countless others." My words seemed to enrage him, his attacks becoming even more ferocious but slightly less controlled. I used this marginal advantage to maneuver toward where Commissar Vask lay, hoping she had recovered enough to provide assistance or at least distract Dravik long enough for me to find an opening. As I fought, I became aware of a change in the chamber around us. The kneeling figures at the altar had risen, their bonds somehow broken in the chaos of battle. They were engaging Dravik's remaining special squad members, fighting with the desperate strength of condemned men granted an unexpected reprieve. More significantly, the altar itself had begun to change. The unholy flame at its peak was flickering, destabilizing, as the ritual it was meant to complete was interrupted. Pulses of energy emanated from it, washing over the combatants in waves that left momentary afterimages burned into my retinas. Dravik sensed the change as well. His head snapped toward the altar, his inhuman features contorting in what might have been alarm. "No!" he roared, his voice shaking dust from the chamber's ceiling. "The alignment is perfect. The sacrifice must be completed." In his moment of distraction, I saw my opportunity. Not to defeat him, I harbored no illusions about my ability to overcome a daemon-possessed Space Marine colonel in direct combat, but to disrupt whatever dark ritual he had been orchestrating, to deny chaos its victory here today. I lunged forward, ducking under Dravik's reflexive counterstrike, and drove the power sword not at him but at the base of the pyramidal altar. The disruptor field met the fused mass of weapons and armor with a sound like 1,000 souls screaming in unison. Energy cascaded outward from the point of impact, arcing through the chamber in bolts of unnatural lightning. Dravik howled in fury and pain as the energy connected with his transformed body, causing his flesh to ripple and distort like fabric caught in a high wind. He staggered backward, momentarily vulnerable as the ritual's power backwashed through him. I pressed my advantage, striking again at the altar, this time higher up its structure. The power sword sank deeper, the disruptor field tearing through the unholy construction with increasing effectiveness as whatever forces had held it together began to unravel. "Kill him!" Dravik commanded his remaining squad members, his voice distorted by pain and rage. "Kill them all, the ritual must not fail." But his forces were occupied with the freed officers and my platoon, unable to intervene as I continued my assault on the altar. Each strike drove the power sword deeper, each impact sending more destructive energy coursing through the chamber. The unholy flame at the altar's peak flickered violently, its non-light pulsing in erratic patterns that hurt the mind to perceive. Cracks appeared in the structure, weeping a substance that might have been blood or might have been something far worse. Dravik recovered enough to launch himself at me, his transformed body now showing signs of instability, patches of human flesh visible through the demonic exterior as though his possession was becoming difficult to maintain. "You fool," he snarled. "You have no idea what forces you're interfering with. The gods themselves have ordained this moment." I turned to meet his charge, the power sword now humming with an intensity that suggested its machine spirit was operating beyond design parameters. Perhaps it sensed the nature of our enemy. Perhaps it was responding to my own desperate determination. Whatever the cause, the blade glowed with an almost white-hot energy as I brought it to bear. Our weapons met in a clash that sent shockwaves through the chamber, staggering combatants on both sides. Dravik's transformed arm, now resembling a serrated blade of crystallized blood, pressed against the power sword with strength that should have overwhelmed me instantly. Yet somehow I held, my muscles burning with the effort, my mind focused on a single thought: deny the enemy victory, whatever the cost. Behind us, the altar gave a final, tortured groan as its structure failed completely. The unholy flame collapsed in upon itself, creating a momentary vacuum that pulled at all matter in the chamber before exploding outward in a wave of pure warp energy. The blast caught Dravik full in the back, lifting him off his feet and sending him hurtling across the chamber to crash against the far wall with bone-crushing force. His body convulsed as the conflicting energies of his possession and the disrupted ritual tore through him, his form shifting rapidly between human and demonic aspects as though both were fighting for dominance. I was not spared the effects. The energy wave struck me like a physical blow, sending me tumbling across the floor of fused skin, the power sword torn from my grasp. Pain, unlike anything I had experienced in my decades of guard service, engulfed me, as though every cell in my body was being simultaneously frozen and incinerated. Through vision blurred by agony, I saw similar effects throughout the chamber. Both sides of the conflict were equally affected, guardsmen and traitors alike thrown about like rag dolls by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The very structure of Desolation Point seemed to be destabilizing, the organic columns vibrating at frequencies that threatened to tear them apart. Commissar Vask appeared at my side, her uniform torn and bloodied, but her eyes clear and focused. She helped me to my feet, supporting my weight as my legs threatened to give way beneath me. "We need to evacuate immediately," she said, her voice hoarse but commanding. "The entire complex is becoming unstable. The warp energies contained in that altar are being released all at once." I nodded, unable to speak through the residual pain still coursing through my system. Using hand signals, I ordered my remaining squad leaders to gather their men and the rescued officers for immediate withdrawal. Vask supported me as we began moving toward the passageway that had brought us into this nightmare, each step a struggle against both physical injury and the increasingly erratic behavior of the chamber itself. Behind us, Colonel Dravik, or the thing he had become, was still alive but incapacitated. His body continued to shift between forms, each transformation accompanied by sounds no human throat should be able to produce. His special squad was either dead or had fled, leaving him abandoned by the dark powers he had served. As we reached the passageway, a final, massive tremor shook the chamber. Chunks of rock and organic matter began falling from the ceiling, crushing anything beneath them. The floor rippled like the surface of a pond disturbed by a thrown stone, making movement increasingly difficult. "Go!" I shouted to my platoon, finding my voice at last. "Double time to the surface. Do not stop for anything." They obeyed without question, years of training overriding fear and confusion. The wounded supported each other, the stronger helping the weaker, all moving with the unified purpose that was the Guard's greatest strength. I took a final look back at the chamber as Vask pulled me into the passageway. The altar was completely destroyed, nothing remaining but a crater that pulsed with residual energy. Of Dravik there was no sign, his body either destroyed in the final collapse or dragged back to whatever hell had spawned his corruption. The ascent was a nightmare of unstable terrain and toxic atmospherics. The passageway that had seemed merely disturbing on our descent was now actively hostile, its walls contracting in peristaltic waves as though trying to crush us, its floor becoming adhesive in places to slow our progress. Several guardsmen were lost to these hazards, their screams echoing briefly before being cut off with terrible finality. By the time we reached the surface, my platoon had been reduced to less than half its original strength. The rescued officers numbered only 3, the others having succumbed to their injuries or the hazards of our escape. Commissar Vask herself was severely wounded, though she refused to acknowledge it, continuing to issue commands and coordinate our evacuation until we had cleared the immediate vicinity of Desolation Point. The other platoons, those that had remained outside as perimeter security, rushed to assist us as we emerged. Their faces registered shock at our condition and reduced numbers, but there was no time for explanations. The ground around Desolation Point was beginning to sink, creating a widening crater as whatever structure had supported the underground complex failed completely. "Fall back to minimum safe distance," Vask ordered, her voice carrying despite her injuries. "Prepare for possible warp manifestation." We retreated to a ridge approximately 1 kilometer from the collapsing structure, establishing a defensive perimeter while the wounded were treated by our limited medical personnel. From this vantage point, we watched as Desolation Point imploded, the jagged spire that had marked its location sinking into the earth with a sound like a dying leviathan. A column of energy erupted from the center of the depression, reaching skyward to penetrate the diseased clouds overhead. For a brief moment, the perpetual twilight of Dravaris was banished, the landscape illuminated by a light that was somehow both blindingly bright and utterly dark, a paradox that strained sanity to perceive. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the energy column collapsed, leaving nothing but a smoking crater where Desolation Point had stood. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the labored breathing of the wounded and the soft clicks of Auspex units scanning for residual energy signatures. Commissar Vask moved to stand beside me at the ridge's edge, her face pale from blood loss but her posture still rigid with imperial discipline. "You destroyed the altar," she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "It seemed the most effective target," I replied, my voice sounding distant and unfamiliar to my own ears. Dravik was too strong to engage directly. She nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips before vanishing beneath her professional mask. "A tactically sound decision, Lieutenant. One that saved not just this mission but potentially the entire Dravaris campaign." I wanted to ask how she had known about Dravik's corruption, how she had been prepared to counter his betrayal when the rest of us were caught completely unaware. But before I could formulate the question, she continued speaking. "We will need to adjust our report for Sector Command. The official record will show that Colonel Dravik died heroically, leading a successful assault on a major Chaos installation. The actual circumstances of his corruption will be classified at the highest level, known only to those with appropriate clearance. The parallels to our handling of Commissar Crane's death were unmistakable. Once again, we would be constructing a noble fiction to replace an ugly truth. Once again, the Imperium's heroes would be those who died with their secrets intact. Is that wise, Commissar?" I asked, treading dangerous ground with the question. If Dravik was corrupted, might there be others in the command structure similarly tainted? Vask's expression hardened, though her eyes held a weariness that suggested she had considered this possibility herself. "That is precisely why the truth must be restricted, Lieutenant. A full investigation will be conducted, but quietly, without alerting potential conspirators. Mass panic about corruption in the officer corps would be more damaging to the war effort than the corruption itself." I nodded, accepting her reasoning even as part of me recoiled from another layer of deception. How many such noble lies formed the foundation of the Imperium? How many heroic narratives concealed darker truths? And did it matter in the end if the result was humanity's continued survival in a galaxy determined to exterminate us? "What happens now?" I asked, gesturing toward the smoking crater that had been our objective. "Now we return to the wall," Vask replied. "We tend our wounded, mourn our dead, and continue the fight. The war for Dravaris is far from over, Lieutenant Venn. Today was merely one battle in a much larger conflict." She paused, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the first extraction Valkyries were appearing as tiny dots against the diseased sky. "And you, Lieutenant, will have decisions to make in the coming days. Your actions today have not gone unnoticed. There will be commendations, promotions offered, new responsibilities. The Imperium rewards those who serve it well, even if the rewards are sometimes double-edged." I understood her meaning. Greater rank meant greater scrutiny, more complex moral compromises, deeper entanglement in the machinery of Imperial governance. The higher one climbed, the more one saw of both the Imperium's majesty and its rot. "I will serve as required, Commissar," I said, falling back on the safe response that had sustained me through countless difficult situations. Vask turned to me fully then, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that suggested she was looking for something specific in my response. Whatever it was, she seemed satisfied with what she found. "Yes, Lieutenant Venn, I believe you will." She straightened, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated her injuries. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. I echoed, the familiar litany both comforting and unsettling in its ambiguity. As the extraction Valkyries descended to retrieve us from the blasted plain, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. From factory worker to conscript to sergeant to lieutenant, from blind faith to doubt to a more complex understanding of what it truly meant to serve the Emperor, the Imperium was flawed, corrupt in places, brutal in its methods, wasteful of human life. Yet it was also humanity's best and perhaps only defense against horrors like those we had encountered today. Dravik's betrayal had shown me the alternative to imperial rule, and it was infinitely worse than even the harshest aspects of the Imperium, so I would continue to serve. Not with the mindless obedience of my early years, nor with the cynical fatalism that had replaced it, but with a clear-eyed understanding of what my service meant. Every lasgun I fired, every order I gave, every sacrifice I made was not for some abstract concept of the Emperor or the Imperium, but for humanity itself. For the countless billions of souls who would never know my name, but whose lives depended on my willingness to stand against the darkness. As I boarded the Valkyrie with the remnants of my platoon, I silently renewed the oath I had taken when the tithe levy came for my hab block. Not the words themselves, which had been empty sounds to my younger self, but the true meaning behind them. I would serve, I would fight, I would die if necessary. Not because I was ordered to, but because I chose to. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that choice might be the only true freedom any of us can hope for.